Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the more peculiar chapters in the long, winding history of Rome. So go ahead, dim the lights, find a cozy spot, and settle in. You might want a blanket, maybe a warm drink, though honestly, neither will help you understand why this story happened. But we'll get there slowly, very slowly. Our story starts, unsurprisingly, in the late ninth century. Rome, 897 AD, which is to say, the kind of time when the city was less about Renaissance charm and more about a chaotic shuffle of popes, noble families, and ambitious clerics who were really determined to have their say, literally, sometimes, over life and death. Rome was a city where politics and religion were so tangled that sometimes it's hard to tell whether someone was attending Mass or a very quiet, very awkward duel. And into this wonderfully convoluted world comes our first and perhaps only dead protagonist, Pope Formosus. Formosus had already had quite a life before his corpse became famous. He was born sometime around 816 AD, though records are hazy. This was not unusual. Documentation in early medieval Europe was more of a suggestion than a requirement. And Formosus was ambitious because, of course, ambition is necessary if you want to make an impact in a city where noble families spend half their time plotting each other's demise. Formosus became pope in 891 AD, which should have been a relatively peaceful job, mostly involving blessings, occasional letters, and staring thoughtfully at stained glass. But of course, it was not peaceful. Formosus had a rather complicated resume before ascending to the papacy. He was Bishop of Porto, which is near Rome, and he had some involvement with the Carolingian politics of the time, meaning he occasionally wore two hats, one religious and one in the very secular game of who gets to rule what. Naturally, this involvement made him a lot of enemies, because nothing says, "Welcome to Rome," like a political disagreement that might later result in a public accusation or a very formal excommunication. And this brings us to a central theme of Formosus's story: enemies. He had many. Some probably deserved it, some probably did not. Formosus's papacy was marked by constant maneuvering. He crowned a king here, granted a bishopric there, all the while trying to keep a delicate balance between factions. And Rome at this time was a particularly messy place to be pope. Noble families fought, the Holy Roman Empire loomed nearby, and every cleric had a strong opinion about what the pope should or should not do. In short, Formosus was a busy man, perhaps too busy to notice that one of his later problems would be, well, post-mortem. By 896, Formosus's health was failing. This is the part of the story that reminds us all that no matter how much power one accrues, eventually the body starts to betray you, often at the most inconvenient moment. Formosus died in April 896, leaving behind the usual chaos of a papal succession in medieval Rome. And so far, things are normal enough. Popes die, other popes succeed them. Rome continues its usual blend of intrigue and confusion. But what happens next is, by historical standards, quite unusual. Enter Pope Stephen VI, a man who, if judged by the faintest of historical evidence, had a flair for drama and a deeply personal sense of justice, or at least a very peculiar interpretation of it. Stephen VI became pope shortly after Formosus's death, and Stephen had opinions, strong opinions, and among these opinions was a belief that Formosus had not been entirely upstanding during his papacy. How much of this belief was sincere and how much was political, we can only guess. But suffice it to say, Stephen the Sixth decided that Formosus needed a trial. Now you might think, well, Formosus is dead. Maybe this trial can wait a century. But no, Stephen the Sixth had a very concrete idea that the trial should happen immediately, in front of a full court. And because historical Rome was a city of excess and spectacle, this trial would involve the deceased pope himself. Yes, Formosus's corpse. Which is to say, in Rome, 897 AD, it was apparently perfectly reasonable to exhumate a former pope, dress him in papal vestments, and set him up on a throne to answer for crimes. The trial itself, known as the Cadaver Synod, was slow, tedious, and from what accounts suggest, quite unpleasant, if you happen to be the corpse in question. Formosus's body was propped up, seated, and attended by a deacon who spoke on his behalf. Because naturally, dead people cannot defend themselves, and the charges, mostly accusations, of having unlawfully ascended to the papacy, a somewhat technical but very real claim in the Byzantine Roman power play of the time. Stephen the Sixth wanted it officially recorded. Formosus had done wrong, and his papacy was invalid. Of course, having a corpse on trial presented certain logistical challenges. For one, decomposition was already underway. There's a line in a chronicle, Dry as You Like, that mentions the body needed to be refreshed for the proceedings. And by refreshed, they probably meant moved a little, maybe propped up more securely, because embalming was not exactly a perfected art in Rome at that point. You can imagine the scene: a decaying pope, a nervous cleric reading charges, and Stephen the Sixth looking very serious about what is arguably the most bizarre court case in history. The synod continued slowly. Witnesses spoke, mostly to confirm the usual bureaucratic details of Formosus's papacy. The crowd, presumably made up of clergy and perhaps a few curious onlookers, murmured politely, and at the end, the verdict was, unsurprisingly, guilty. Formosus was posthumously stripped of his titles, and his ordinations were declared null, which, if you were one of the priests ordained by Formosus, might have been a very inconvenient technicality. And then came the ceremonial part. Formosus's corpse was stripped of its papal garments, likely while still upright, and thrown into the Tiber River, Rome's not-so-private dump for inconvenient things. There are other accounts that suggest he was later recovered and reburied, but the initial indignity is what people remember. The Cadaver Synod, in short, was a public humiliation of the deceased pope, conducted with all the solemnity Rome could muster, and probably attended by people who were quietly glad they were alive. Now, you might wonder, why would Stephen the Sixth do such a thing? Part of it was politics. Formosus had backed rival factions, angered influential nobles, and left a mess of papal loyalties that Stephen the Sixth had to clean up, or at least pretend to. Part of it was a need to assert authority, a very literal demonstration that even death did not exempt one from accountability. And part of it, well, part of it was just Rome, 897 AD, where strange things happened because, why not? Let's float over to another aspect of this tale, the public reaction. Unsurprisingly, citizens were horrified, or at least puzzled by this spectacle. There are reports of unrest, murmurs, and a general sense that maybe, just maybe, the Pope had gone a little far, which historically speaking is often how these things go. A leader overreaches the city's size, and eventually someone else replaces them. And indeed, Stephen VI did not last long. Within months, he was deposed and eventually strangled in prison. Not a happy ending, but at least historically tidy. All right, so now that we've gently watched the corpse of Pope Formosus be tried, found guilty, and tossed into the Tiber, let's settle in and float downstream, metaphorically, to see what happened next. Take a slow sip of whatever you're drinking. Perhaps hum a little tune. We're in for another leisurely stretch of Roman history. After the Cadaver Synod, the city of Rome didn't exactly throw a parade. The populace, clergy, and anyone with even a faint sense of decency were uncomfortable. The spectacle of a dead pope on trial had a way of dampening enthusiasm, even for those used to seeing ambitious nobles argue over scraps of land. In short, it was awkward. Not long after, Stephen VI, the orchestrator of this morbid court, began to face some consequences of his own. There is a certain rhythm to medieval Rome: overreach, public murmuring, deposition, and then occasionally a quick, quiet exit from the world. Stephen VI did not escape this pattern. Within a few months of his gleeful posthumous prosecution, he was deposed. His end, as historical sources suggest with a quiet, dry note, was by strangulation in prison. Not exactly the most relaxing end, but appropriate for someone who decided that exhuming a pope was a reasonable way to handle political disputes. Meanwhile, Formosus's corpse, though discarded in the river, was not forgotten. In the years that followed, his supporters worked to rehabilitate him. Part of this rehabilitation involved retrieving his body from wherever the Tiber had deposited it, which, let's be honest, could not have been an entirely pleasant process. But history has a way of making these things ceremonial rather than practical. Formosus was reburied, this time with the dignity more appropriate for a pope, or at least the kind of dignity that can be assigned retrospectively. And here's an interesting note: the repeated exhumation, trial, and eventual reburial of Formosus contributed to a long-lasting memory in Rome, a kind of lesson in humility for popes and ambitious clerics. Or at least it might have, if anyone had actually paid attention. The Cadaver Synod became infamous because it was such a bizarre event. Even by the standards of medieval politics, trying a corpse was unusual. Most historians, who tend to be quite tolerant of weirdness in this period, mark it as particularly egregious. It's worth pausing here and thinking about what this tells us about the papacy at the time. Rome in the late 9th century was not exactly a place where one could expect consistency. Popes could be ambitious, scheming, or excessively dramatic. Clerics could wield influence, often through intimidation or by simply being present in the right room at the right time. And the laity, those ordinary citizens wandering the streets, mostly just tried to keep out of the way. Within this context, the Cadaver Synod is less a freak anomaly and more a natural, if absurd, outcome of the ongoing tug-of-war for influence in Rome. Let's drift a little further into the political and social implications. Formosus's ordinations, technically annulled by Stephen VI, caused some ripples in the clerical world. Priests and bishops ordained by Formosus were suddenly in a kind of bureaucratic limbo. Did this mean their sacraments were invalid? Some argued yes. Others argued quietly that people tend to follow the rules of logic more than the whims of a recently deceased pope's trial. The debates were probably very dull, though no less important for the clergy trying to figure out if they could continue their jobs without breaking canon law. And this leads us to a subtle point about reputation and legacy. Formosus, despite his posthumous humiliation, eventually regained some measure of respect. Later, popes acknowledged his work, and the events of the Cadaver Synod became more of a cautionary tale than a judgment on his life. You could say, in the slow and ironic tone Rome tends to favor, that Formosus outlasted his critics, though he did so as a corpse for part of the journey. It's a reminder that in history, timing is everything, and even a very short lived scandal can fade if enough people agree to forget the details. Now, one might wonder about the psychological dimension. Why would Stephen VI undertake such a bizarre act? Some historians speculate it was a matter of personal vendetta. Others suggest it was political theater, designed to intimidate opposing factions. Whatever the reason, the psychological landscape of the time was one where symbols mattered immensely. Exhuming a pope, dressing him in official robes, and subjecting him to a trial was a very clear symbol. Nobody, not even a corpse, was beyond scrutiny. And yet, for all its symbolism, it also seems to have backfired in the long run, given Stephen's rapid deposition and the eventual rehabilitation of Formosus. Let's meander a bit into the cultural side. The Cadaver Synod illustrates a peculiar aspect of medieval religious culture, the intertwining of law, ritual, and theater. Trials were often elaborate, performative, and designed to convey authority. In this case, the performance involved a corpse, which is a level of commitment most of us don't encounter outside of horror movies or very dedicated reenactments. It's worth noting that medieval Europeans didn't necessarily find this grotesque. They were, by and large, accustomed to ritual displays of power that could be intimidating, confusing, and occasionally macabre. And Rome, being the center of Christendom, tended to amplify these spectacles. From a modern perspective, it's tempting to focus on the oddity, the absurdity of a corpse being judged. But in its own context, the Cadaver Synod was an attempt to enforce legitimacy, assert authority, and navigate a web of political and religious alliances. Rome was, after all, a city where appearances mattered as much as deeds, and a well-executed spectacle could carry more weight than the subtle wisdom of a living pope. As we drift toward the end of this section, it's interesting to consider the aftermath for the city itself. The memory of the Cadaver Synod lingered for decades, influencing how popes thought about authority, ritual, and the dangers of overreach. It also became a point of curiosity for chroniclers who relayed the story with a mix of horror, fascination, and occasional dry humor. For the citizens, it may have been unsettling, but life in Rome continued. Nobles argued, clerics schemed, and the occasional bizarre event reminded everyone to keep their wits about them. And so, Formosus's story, in its slow, unfolding weirdness, leaves us with a gentle lesson about the peculiarities of history. A pope, ambitious and politically engaged, dies. Another pope, dramatic and vindictive, attempts a posthumous prosecution. The corpse is humiliated, and the orchestrator pays a price. Eventually, memory and ritual reconcile themselves, and history moves on quietly, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. All right, so we've gently exhumed a pope, put him on trial, thrown him into a river, and seen his eventual reburial. Let's now float lazily through the next layer of consequences. The subtle echoes of the Cadaver Synod and the long, quiet lessons it taught, or failed to teach, Rome's papal succession. Make yourself comfortable. Maybe take a slow stretch, roll your shoulders, sip something warm. The next century of intrigue is less violent than you might think, but just as quietly absurd. Immediately after Stephen VI was deposed and met his grim, albeit not dramatic end, Rome faced the usual scramble of power. Popes came and went with remarkable speed during this period. Some reigned for years, others for a few months, and some barely made it to consecration before being replaced. It was a slow, revolving carousel of personalities, ambitions, and occasional incompetence, and through it all, the shadow of Formosus's corpse lingered, almost like a whisper reminding everyone Rome, in the ninth century, had a rather flexible relationship with propriety. The next few popes, Romanus, Theodore II, John the Ninth, each inherited a city still grappling with the aftermath of Stephen VI's theatrics. One might assume that the Cadaver Synod would have been universally condemned and forgotten as a grotesque aberration. But in medieval Rome, universal condemnation was more of a polite suggestion. Many clerics were busy trying to sort out administrative matters, ensure the loyalty of bishops, and occasionally remind nobles not to start skirmishes over nothing, which was already a full-time endeavor. In this environment, the story of Formosus's posthumous trial became part of a larger tapestry of papal peculiarities, rather than a singular horror story. John the Ninth, who followed Theodore II, took steps to rehabilitate Formosus formally. This included declaring the Cadaver Synod null and void and restoring the legitimacy of Formosus's ordinations. Now imagine being a priest during this time. One day your ordination is valid. The next day it's void because a dead pope was found guilty. And then, a few months later, it's valid again. It's the kind of bureaucratic whiplash that makes modern office paperwork seem tame by comparison. But John Ninth, gently, quietly, reversed the previous errors. Rome, as ever, adjusted to this new normal with a slow, collective shrug. Of course, the reverberations were not just clerical. The Cadaver Synod left a subtle mark on the psyche of Rome itself. Chroniclers, who were already fond of long, dry accounts of papal deeds, devoted a fair amount of ink to the event. The story was repeated in monasteries, in letters between clergy, and in the occasional sermon. It became an illustrative tale about the dangers of overreaching ambition, the peculiarities of authority, and, perhaps most importantly, the need to occasionally check that popes remain among the living before accusing them of misconduct. And yet, the curious thing about history is that it tends to move on. The scandal of a corpse on trial was remarkable, but it didn't fundamentally change the rhythm of papal politics. Ambition, factionalism, and ceremonial display continued to dominate. Popes still jockeyed for influence, noble families still maneuvered, and the occasional absurdity cropped up to keep chroniclers busy. In many ways, the Cadaver Synod was a symptom of a larger problem, a system where personality, political alliances, and theatrical authority mattered more than consistency or predictability. Let's pause to float over another detail that's often overlooked. Formosus's posthumous humiliation didn't only affect popes and clergy. It also influenced how nobles, military leaders, and foreign powers approached Rome. If a pope could be humiliated after death, What did that say about living allies or enemies? The optics mattered immensely. Treaties, appointments, and alliances were now colored by the knowledge that Rome had a history of dramatic, even macabre, spectacle. And while this might not have caused literal fear, well, maybe a little, it certainly added a layer of caution, subtle and slow moving, to political decisions. Interestingly, the Cadaver Synod also had ripple effects in the way subsequent popes approached ritual and authority. There was a gradual understanding, slow, almost imperceptible, that extreme theatrical gestures could backfire. Stephen VI's fate was a cautionary tale, even if Rome didn't articulate it formally. Popes became more measured in their public displays, at least for a time, preferring to enforce authority through administrative measures and alliances rather than exhuming corpses. Not that they stopped being dramatic entirely. Rome rarely stops being dramatic, but they learned that sometimes subtlety wins. And so we drift into a quiet reflection on human nature as revealed through history. The Cadaver Synod reminds us that ambition does not expire with life. Reputation can be fragile, but also oddly resilient. And bureaucracy, even in the 9th century, can be both absurd and enduring. Formosus, who had navigated a complicated political landscape during his life, continued to influence the city and its clerics long after death. In a sense, his posthumous trial was less a punishment than a commentary on the curious priorities of Rome. Let's linger for a moment on the broader theme. Medieval Rome loved ritual, spectacle, and symbolic acts. It's tempting to laugh at the idea of a pope on trial after death, but the citizens of the time were operating within a coherent system of meaning. Authority was performative, legitimacy was performative, and even the most absurd acts, if conducted properly, carried weight. The Cadaver Synod, grotesque to modern eyes, was entirely coherent within its historical logic, though still unpleasant for those who value quiet, orderly church proceedings. By the end of the 10th century, Rome had settled into its usual rhythm of papal succession, intrigue, and quiet scandal. The Cadaver Synod faded from immediate memory, though it remained a point of fascination for chroniclers. Formosus's name endured, not for the crime he allegedly committed, but for the remarkable posthumous adventure that punctuated his life and shaped the stories told by those who came after. And in this slow, gently ironic way, history teaches us that absurdity is not the opposite of consequence. It is often its companion. All right, so we've drifted lazily through the bizarre trial of a pope's corpse, the downfall of Stephen VI, the quiet rehabilitation of Formosus, and the ripple effects on Rome. Let's now settle in for a slow, reflective glide through the broader implications of this peculiar episode. Dim the lights further, perhaps cradle a warm cup of something calming, and let's meander through history. There is no rush. When we think about the Cadaver Synod today, it reads like a historical oddity, a curiosity reserved for textbooks or lists of strange events. But in its own time, it was deeply tied to human ambition, politics, and the enduring desire for control. Stephen VI wanted to assert his authority. Formosus had allies and enemies, living, and it turns out, posthumously. Rome, meanwhile, continued its patient, slow-motion negotiation between ritual, spectacle, and governance. One of the enduring lessons here is that authority, even sacred authority, is never simple. Popes were not just spiritual leaders, they were political actors, negotiators, and performers. Every act, from issuing decrees to crowning kings, carried weight. And the Cadaver Synod is a perfect illustration of what happens when performance overtakes prudence. Stephen VI's dramatic trial of a corpse demonstrated that even well-intentioned authority can be absurd, especially when driven by personal vendettas. Formosis's own story reminds us that legacy is complicated. During his lifetime, he navigated a politically fraught Rome with moderate success. After his death, his enemies attempted to erase him, yet his memory endured, slowly rehabilitated by those who remembered him differently. History, in this sense, but operates gently and persistently, often forgiving what living politics cannot. A corpse cannot defend itself, but stories, letters, and institutional memory can. Let's float over another aspect, the subtle psychological dimension of the time. Medieval Rome was a world where symbolism mattered immensely. A pope could not only die and be judged, but the very manner of judgment conveyed moral, spiritual, and political lessons. For the populace, witnessing or hearing of the Cadaver Synod was a reminder that authority is performative, that politics is intricate, and that even death does not automatically confer peace. And for the clerics, it was a bureaucratic puzzle, undoing ordinations, reconciling canon law, and quietly ensuring that life could continue, both spiritually and administratively, despite the theatrics. Another quiet lesson lies in human ambition and fragility. Stephen VI overreached. His dramatic gesture, while intended to assert control, instead hastened his own downfall. Rome's slow but inevitable mechanisms of balance reasserted themselves. Ambition, when divorced from prudence, carries its own weight, and sometimes history delivers consequences in gentle, inexorable ways, rather than in sudden, shocking moments. It's the slow drip of irony rather than a dramatic clap of thunder. Looking at the Cadaver Synod through a modern lens, it might seem grotesque, almost surreal. A corpse on trial is inherently absurd, but medieval Rome had a different sense of coherence. Ritual, legality, and symbolism intersected in ways that are foreign to our contemporary expectations. The synod was less about horror and more about reinforcing social and political hierarchies, ensuring that allegiances were understood, and demonstrating that authority, living or dead, was accountable, at least theatrically. There's also a gentle irony in the fact that despite the grotesque nature of the act, Rome eventually normalized the situation. Formosus was reburied with dignity, his ordinations restored, and history quietly absorbed the event. People continued their daily lives, nobles continued their scheming, and popes continued to navigate the complicated web of religion and politics. Life, as always, went on. And perhaps that is the slow, almost meditative lesson. History has room for absurdity, but it does not allow it to dominate indefinitely. We can also consider the Cadaver Synod in the broader context of medieval Europe. Ambition, rivalry, and spectacle were not unique to Rome. Across the continent, kings, dukes, bishops, and minor nobles engaged in subtle or overt theatrical displays to assert power. Sometimes these displays were harmless, sometimes destructive, and sometimes, like the trial of a dead pope, they were quietly astonishing. The Cadaver Synod, in this sense, serves as a quiet reminder of the extremes of human imagination, patience, and political theater. As we drift toward the conclusion of this slow, gentle journey, let's reflect on the human themes embedded in the story. Authority is fragile. Reputation is both enduring and fleeting. Ambition can extend beyond life, as can vindication. And history, in its calm, steady way, allows events to unfold, absorb, and eventually normalize even the most bizarre circumstances. A corpse on trial may seem extreme, but the lessons it teaches about human behavior, political theater, and legacy are timeless if delivered in a soft, unhurried fashion. And so, as you settle in for the night, perhaps lying back and letting your mind wander through the corridors of medieval Rome, consider this. The cadaver synod was absurd, yes, but it was also deeply human. It involved ambition, fear, memory, and the intricate, patient mechanics of politics. It was a reminder that life, death, and history are all interwoven, sometimes in ways that seem ridiculous, sometimes in ways that feel inevitable. Let's take one last gentle moment to appreciate the slow humor of history. A pope who ruled, a pope who judged, a city that watched, and a world that continued. The absurdity did not ruin Rome. It did not erase Formosus. And it did not prevent the next pope from waking up, adjusting his vestments, and carrying on with the delicate, absurd, endlessly human work of being pope. So tonight, as you drift off, remember the cadaver synod, not as a tale of horror, but as a quietly bizarre reflection on ambition, authority, and the gentle persistence of history. Rome marches on, popes rise and fall, corpses are sometimes judged, and yet life continues slowly, serenely, and with just a touch of irony. Begin with a new story that is, well, slightly unusual. It's one of those events that seems like it could have been made up, yet for once it wasn't. So dim the lights, grab a warm cup of something soothing, maybe a blanket. Let your shoulders relax, and let's slowly float into the strange, swirling world of Strasbourg in the year 1518. Now, Strasbourg, as you may know, was a city in what is today eastern France, though back then it was technically part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was cobbled streets, half-timbered houses, and a fair share of smelly livestock wandering around, because hygiene in the early 16th century was, of course, optional. Life was generally hard, monotonous, and peppered with religious observances, market days, and the occasional mysterious illness. People worried about famine, war, and their eternal souls. And sometimes, very occasionally, they worried about dancing themselves to death, because that is exactly what happened. It all started, as so many strange things do, with one woman, a woman named Frau Trophea, who, for reasons that were never entirely clear, began dancing. Not just a little waltz in her kitchen, but full-on, vigorous, feet-moving, arms flailing, whole body shaking dance in the middle of the street. It was July, which was probably hot and sticky, though that didn't seem to matter to her. She danced for hours, and when she finally stopped, because all humans eventually do, she apparently just went home and slept, perhaps dreaming of more steps. Now, a normal person might shrug this off. Some woman had a moment, people may have thought. But Strasbourg, in its peculiar 16th century wisdom, did not shrug. Instead, more people started dancing. Neighbors, friends, curious onlookers, men, women, even children joined in. And so the dance spread. One person, then two, then dozens, then hundreds. Streets became a sea of flailing arms and stomping feet. People called it the dancing plague, though obviously they didn't have Instagram to really capture the aesthetic. Medical explanations, contemporary or modern, are somewhat lacking. Some thought it was divine punishment, which was a popular default explanation for any weird event back then. Others suggested it was some form of mass hysteria, perhaps brought on by stress, famine, or bad bread. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and can cause hallucinations and convulsions. There's also the theory that people were simply dancing because dancing seemed better than crying. The city authorities naturally were uncertain. They didn't quite know whether to arrest the dancers, exorcise them, or encourage them. And so, in a move that is quietly horrifying and slightly bureaucratic, they built a stage. Yes, a stage. They thought perhaps that if people were going to dance uncontrollably, it might be better to provide a designated space for it. They even hired musicians. Because, of course, why not double down? If the streets are chaos, at least the chaos can be somewhat coordinated. And so, the dancing continued. Days turned into weeks. Some of the dancers collapsed from exhaustion. Some reportedly died from heart attacks or strokes. Reports suggest the numbers of afflicted varied from dozens to hundreds at a time. Some accounts mention that city physicians prescribed more dancing as a cure, which, as one might imagine, only perpetuated the problem. It's easy, when looking back, to imagine this as a kind of absurd carnival, a historical curiosity. But for the people involved, it was not amusing. There was fear, there was fatigue, and perhaps, somewhere under the sun, a strange communal resignation. If you must dance, you may as well do it together. Let's float over to another aspect of this story, which is the social context. Strasbourg was at the time a city of religious tension, economic strain, and occasional plague scares. People were anxious, they were stressed. And stress, as modern psychology might note, can manifest in strange ways. Collective stress, in particular, sometimes manifests in collective phenomena that are to outsiders bewildering. So perhaps the dancing plague was a kind of citywide coping mechanism, executed involuntarily, but still coping in its peculiar rhythmic way. Meanwhile, authorities were stuck in a loop of maybe encourage it, maybe stop it, maybe just let it be. It's hard to imagine any bureaucrat today suggesting a mass dance as a public health intervention. But in 1518, Strasbourg, desperation and superstition combined in ways that seem very, very polite compared to the general chaos. Frau Trophea herself, of course, became something of a legend. Whether she danced alone or simply sparked the initial wave, she embodies the human strangeness that persists even in orderly societies. She reminds us that sometimes history is not about kings or wars, but about small, inexplicable human gestures, gestures that ripple outward, affecting hundreds of lives. And so, the city danced, streets filled with people stomping in patterns they could not fully control. Neighbors called to each other, families tried to intervene, physicians shook their heads, suggesting remedies that ranged from more dancing to pray harder. Clergy scolded, warned, and performed rituals. Musicians played. The sun rose and set. And still, the dance continued. We might pause here for a gentle breath. Me picture it. Cobblestones, sweat, the faint smell of unwashed linen, musicians in slightly faded jackets playing melodies to accompany hundreds of exhausted yet determined dancers. It's not an image that invites excitement so much as a kind of slow fascination. And as night fell over Strasbourg, the city eventually began to see a decline in the dance. People collapsed from exhaustion. The summer heat waned. Some historians suggest that by September, most of the dancers had either recovered or passed away quietly, and the city returned to its usual rhythm, slightly more cautious perhaps about public gatherings, and slightly more aware that humans collectively are capable of unusual things. 1518. The city is still very much alive, though, in a slightly unusual way. Its inhabitants are dancing quite literally into the summer heat. Now, it's tempting to imagine that Frau Trophea, the woman who started it all, was some kind of magical figure, perhaps blessed or cursed by fate. But history, as always, is less interested in magic and more in paperwork, chronicles, and the occasional hyperbolic eyewitness account. According to municipal records, after she began dancing, dozens of others joined. And then, before anyone could figure out what was happening, it became a kind of chain reaction. One person's nervous energy seemed to leap to another. People who were tired, hungry, anxious, or just bored, probably all of the above, suddenly found themselves propelled into movement. Imagine the city streets, narrow, cobbled, lined with half-timbered houses that lean slightly with age. Merchants' stalls are scattered with vegetables, fabrics, and perhaps a few live chickens. And through all of this, people are moving continuously, step after step. Arms flail, feet stomp. Some look like they are performing an intricate ritual. Others are simply trying to stay upright. You can almost hear the collective heartbeat of the city, drumming in sync with hundreds of footsteps. Municipal authorities, understandably, were in a bind. What do you do when your citizens are possessed, voluntarily or involuntarily, by an uncontrollable compulsion to dance? If you try to stop them, you risk public unrest. If you encourage them, you risk exhaustion, injury, and the occasional fatality. So Strasbourg tried something in between. They built stages, they hired musicians. Yes, actual musicians. One can only imagine the trumpet players, drum beaters, and fiddlers pacing carefully to avoid the cascade of flailing limbs. The city wanted to channel the energy, provide a venue, maybe even claim that this was for public health or spiritual cleansing. And in their way, it worked. For a short while, the organized chaos seemed more contained. Dancers were given water, food, and encouragement to keep going. Physicians, who had a mixture of authority and befuddlement, suggested remedies that ranged from herbal concoctions to more dancing. One can picture the small lecture halls. "You are dancing too little," they might have said, or perhaps, "Pray harder and then dance harder." Their tone was likely monotone, official, and when read today, gently absurd. We might pause to consider the personal experiences of individual dancers. Most names have been lost to history, though some chroniclers took care to mention certain cases. Frau Trophea, for example, seems to have danced alone at first, oblivious to the curious crowds. Then there were others, unnamed, who began to collapse mid-step, only to be helped or ignored by fellow dancers. Accounts suggest that men and women, young and old, were all affected. Some historians speculate that stress, anxiety, or nutritional deficiencies contributed to the compulsion. Others note that it may have been mass hysteria, a collective nervous reaction to the strains of city life. Consider the conditions of the time. Strasbourg, like much of Europe in the early 16th century, was grappling with economic instability, disease, and religious uncertainty. People were accustomed to sudden catastrophes, from crop failures to outbreaks of plague. So, when faced with this inexplicable dancing, the city was probably simultaneously terrified and resigned. Humans, after all, adapt in strange ways. Some danced for hours, some danced for days, and some, tragically, danced until death intervened quietly, unnoticed amidst the rhythmic chaos. As the days stretched into weeks, the city's response evolved. Some records suggest that local clergy were involved, offering prayers, blessings, and perhaps some gentle admonishment. Perhaps they preached, "This is a warning from God. Dance responsibly." Others tried to enforce modesty, urging dancers to cover themselves appropriately, which, given the heat of July, was likely ignored. The rhythm of the city became inseparable from the rhythm of the feet moving continuously through the streets. Now let's think about the medical understanding of the time. Physicians were baffled naturally. Their remedies were grounded in humoral theory, astrology, and herbal medicine. They recommended things like bloodletting, massages, or more dancing, because again, if the body is moving, perhaps the spirit will settle. Today, we might call it collective psychogenic movement disorder, or attribute it to ergot poisoning, which comes from a fungus that grows on rye and can cause hallucinations, spasms, and convulsions. But in 1518, the scientific method was still a distant dream. People relied on observation, superstition, and tradition, and occasionally on sheer hope. One interesting aspect of this phenomenon is how it spread socially. Dancing, in this case, was almost contagious, not in a literal virus sense, but in a human behavior sense. If one person starts moving uncontrollably in the street, others see it, feel a strange compulsion, and join in. There is something mesmerizing about 100 bodies moving in sync, even if that sync is partial, awkward, or painful. Imagine walking down a street today and seeing dozens of people suddenly start an unplanned flash mob, but no one is smiling and no one has rehearsed. That is what Strasbourg experienced, on a larger, more tragic scale. And yet, there was an odd sense of order. The city attempted to document the phenomenon. City records mention numbers, dates, and efforts to contain the dancers. Chroniclers wrote in a calm, detached tone, noting how many were dancing, how long they danced, and the occasional casualty. Reading these records today, one gets a sense of both the absurdity and the gravity of the situation. People were dying, streets were crowded, and yet the city carried on, doing what cities always do, observing, recording, and slowly adapting. The dancing plague lasted for roughly a month, fading gradually as exhaustion set in. People returned to their homes, sometimes permanently weakened, sometimes quietly deceased. Authorities eventually stopped hiring musicians. Stages were removed. Streets returned to their normal rhythm. And yet, the memory lingered. Chroniclers continued to write about it, passing it down to later historians who would marvel at the human strangeness of it all. As we drift further into this narrative, it's worth noting the broader context. Strasbourg, at this time, was a microcosm of early modern Europe, a mix of superstition, religion, economic pressure, and human creativity. The dancing plague is unusual because it is vivid, documented, and inexplicable. It reminds us that history is not only kings, wars, and treaties. Sometimes it is small, peculiar, human gestures, like dancing in the street until one can dance no more. So tonight, as you imagine Strasbourg under a hot July sun, with hundreds of bodies moving, occasionally collapsing, occasionally laughing quietly in confusion, let yourself sink into the gentle absurdity. Let the streets sway in your mind. Let the sound of hundreds of uncoordinated steps mingle with the soft rhythm of your own breathing. This is history, sleepy, strange, and quietly fascinating. After the first week of the dancing, the plague, or phenomenon if you prefer, was no longer just Frau Trophäa. By this point, dozens more had joined. Chroniclers, with their careful monotone, describe a curious mix of participants. Some were middle aged, accustomed to the predictable rhythm of daily market life. Others were young, perhaps restless, their energy channeled into this strange communal movement. Children sometimes joined, dragging their small feet into the pattern, though parents were reportedly perplexed and occasionally frustrated. Imagine, if you will, the daily routine. People would rise in the early morning, perhaps eat a small breakfast of bread or porridge, and then she'd start dance. Streets became theaters, courtyards became stages. Merchants adjusted their stalls around clusters of moving bodies, sometimes shouting polite requests to avoid collisions. Horses and carts were rerouted. Observers leaned out of windows, watching the choreography of fatigue, curiosity, and compulsion unfold. And through all of this, the city officials, perhaps in linen coats, perhaps fanning themselves in the summer heat, scribbled notes, occasionally sighing. Some dancers, according to records, had peculiar habits. One woman reportedly carried a small pouch of dried herbs, shaking it occasionally, perhaps in belief that it would ward off evil spirits or calm her feet. Another dancer, a man of indeterminate age, would periodically pause to drink from a communal bowl of water provided by neighbors, only to resume immediately afterward, as if hydration were a small punctuation mark in the ongoing sentence of movement. These tiny details, mundane in isolation, collectively illustrate a life wholly surrendered to rhythm and repetition. Authorities were increasingly involved. City councils met in cool chambers with tall windows and heavy curtains, debating endlessly about the best course of action. Some suggested sending dancers out into the countryside, reasoning that fresh air might break the compulsion. Others argued for religious interventions, processions, prayers, or confessions. There were whispers of punitive measures, though in practice these were largely ignored, perhaps because no one wanted to be the one to halt 100 flailing citizens and risk angering a supernatural force. Physicians, meanwhile, remained perplexed. Their recommended remedies were as varied as they were mild: gentle massages, walking, more dancing, and occasionally the use of herbal mixtures meant to balance the humors. Some chroniclers noted the irony. To cure this strange compulsion, one must often dance more. It's almost a mantra of the time. The cure is the continuation. The solution lies in persistence. Let's pause to consider the emotional state of the dancers. Contemporary accounts suggest a mixture of confusion, determination, and exhaustion. Some were exhilarated, caught up in the novelty of motion, the communal experience. Others were terrified, aware that their bodies would not obey their wills. A few likely resigned themselves to a kind of gentle fatalism. If this is the dance they must perform, it will continue until their bodies can no longer comply. Imagine this, if you will, waking each morning to a compulsion that is invisible, irresistible, and utterly public. The progression of days reveals a rhythm in itself. Early mornings were slow, tentative, feet lifting, arms stretching. By mid morning, momentum built. Streets became crowded, music floated through the air, and some dancers adopted near ritualistic patterns, circles, figure eights, steps that resembled folk dances but lacked instruction. By afternoon, exhaustion set in. Some dancers collapsed in courtyards or against walls, only to be helped up by neighbors or to rise again through sheer muscle memory. Nights were brief respites, sometimes filled with restless sleep, perhaps haunted by the steps they could not resist. One particularly fascinating aspect is how the city tried to impose structure. Chroniclers describe the hiring of musicians, drummers, fiddlers, perhaps even a flute player or two, to accompany the dancers. These performers were instructed to maintain a moderate tempo, slow enough to prevent immediate collapse, but energetic enough to keep momentum. Imagine a street orchestra performing for hundreds of bodies that cannot stop moving. One can picture the musicians, sweating under the July sun, their faces set in polite determination, occasionally stepping aside to avoid an inadvertent kick. Let's float briefly to the social implications. Families were divided between participation and observation. Neighbors brought food and water, perhaps a gentle word of encouragement, perhaps a reprimand. Steady now, do not trip over the cart. The city, in its bureaucratic calm, documented the number of dancers, sometimes down to exact figures, though other times approximating in the sleepy way chroniclers have of noting human chaos. Reports suggest that at the height of the plague, hundreds of citizens were affected simultaneously. Interestingly, some dancers apparently developed what might today be considered ritualistic habits. One man reportedly carried a small bell, ringing it to mark a change in direction. Another kept a talisman, perhaps a saint's relic, held tightly in one hand while he moved the other in graceful or panicked circles. These small personal flourishes reveal the human desire to impose meaning, even in the midst of seemingly meaningless activity. By the second week, exhaustion became more visible. Some dancers, having performed nearly nonstop, began to suffer fainting spells. A few reportedly died, quietly, their bodies folding in corners of streets and courtyards. The city continued to provide water and food, though mostly for the living. Physicians documented these fainting episodes and deaths with calm monotony, noting causes as collapse from continued movement or excessive heat and fatigue. It is notable how official records blend the absurd and the tragic without drama, leaving us today with a gentle, sleep-inducing sense of human endurance and frailty. Meanwhile, the city council continued to debate. The discussions were long, the solutions mild, and the results mixed. Some counselors suggested sending dancers to a shrine outside the city, reasoning that a pilgrimage might break the compulsion. Others recommended isolation, hoping that removing witnesses would reduce the social spread of the phenomenon. In practice, little was effective, and the city settled into a quiet tolerance. Let the dancers move, let the musicians play, let the city observe. As we drift to the final stage of this part of the story, it's worth noting that by the end of the month, many dancers had either recovered or succumbed quietly to exhaustion or minor illness. Streets returned to their usual rhythm. Markets reopened, carts clattered along cobbles, and the air settled into the gentle hum of normal city life. And yet, the memory lingered. Chroniclers continued to write about it for decades, reminding later generations that human behavior, especially under stress, can manifest in astonishingly strange ways. So tonight, as you imagine Strasbourg's streets, let yourself picture hundreds of feet moving together in a slow, unstoppable rhythm. Arms rise and fall, sweat glistens, musicians play cautiously, and the city watches, calm, bureaucratic, and quietly amazed. There's a kind of hypnotic beauty in this, a reminder that history is not only about kings or battles, but about ordinary humans in extraordinary circumstances. By this point in the summer, the phenomenon had reached its peak. Hundreds of people were involved, each with their own reasons and habits and peculiarities. Some danced with a quiet determination, as if moving were an obligation dictated by an unseen force. Others seemed to sway more whimsically, their steps meandering, almost like a river finding its path. It's worth imagining the scene slowly, the cobblestones warmed by the sun, merchant stalls carefully arranged to avoid collisions, and occasional carts inching through the moving tide of feet. Let's consider some of the individuals, to the extent that history allows us. Frau Trophea, of course, had already been mentioned, the originator of the chain reaction. But beyond her, chroniclers note a variety of participants. There was an elderly man, perhaps in his 60s, who reportedly carried a small cane. Despite his age and frailty, he joined the streets daily, swaying slowly, occasionally pausing to steady himself. His neighbors were reportedly concerned, though they allowed him to continue, perhaps respecting his persistence, or perhaps unsure what else to do. A young woman, unnamed in records, danced with a rhythm that seemed almost joyful. She moved in careful circles, occasionally smiling faintly, as if the dance offered some escape from the mundane, stressful life of early 16th century Strasbourg. Others were less fortunate. A man in his 30s who collapsed repeatedly, assisted gently by neighbors or fellow dancers, only to rise again and continue. Chroniclers recorded this incident matter-of-factly, noting fainting as a natural consequence of prolonged exertion and heat without embellishment. Now, the city council's response is particularly interesting. Meetings were held in dim chambers, sunlight streaming through high windows. Councilors debated remedies in long, measured sentences. Some suggested that removing the dancers from the city might help, perhaps a kind of pilgrimage to a shrine outside Strasbourg. Others argued for the provision of more water and food, reasoning that basic sustenance might prolong survival and reduce panic. And yet, others proposed a spiritual solution: prayers, blessings, and confessions, because the divine, of course, had a role in everything. Physicians, meanwhile, maintained a quiet, professional bewilderment. Remedies were often contradictory. One physician recommended herbal baths to soothe muscles, another suggested gentle massage, and a few, more cautiously, recommended additional dancing, believing it might balance the humors or prevent stasis in the body. It is worth noting that none of these suggestions were aggressive, all carefully measured, reflecting the calm, bureaucratic sensibility of early modern medicine. Let's pause to imagine a typical day. Dawn breaks. Dancers rise slowly from their beds, many exhausted from the previous day. Streets gradually fill as neighbors emerge to observe or join. Musicians, hired by the city, assemble their instruments and cautiously begin to play. Fiddles, flutes, and drums create a gentle rhythm that threads through the moving crowd, Children weave carefully among the adults, some timid, some emboldened. By midday, the momentum is at its height. Feet pound cobblestones, arms rise and fall, and the city hums with controlled chaos. The emotional texture of these days is fascinating. Chroniclers describe a mixture of confusion, resignation, and occasionally quiet exhilaration. Some dancers reportedly felt a strange liberation, a temporary freedom from social expectation or personal anxiety. Others were terrified, aware that their bodies were no longer entirely their own. It is a delicate balance of compulsion and choice, exhaustion and fleeting pleasure. Imagine the hum of hundreds of feet, punctuated by faint laughter or gasps under a summer sun. The scene is not dramatic in a cinematic sense. It is slow, hypnotic, strangely beautiful, and gently tragic. Medical theories of the time, meanwhile, evolved in quiet stages. Some thought it was a curse, others divine punishment. A few speculated ergot poisoning, though this was never confirmed. Today, historians debate whether the phenomenon was primarily psychogenic, stemming from collective anxiety and stress, or partially physiological, influenced by environmental and nutritional factors. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Regardless, physicians documented the phenomenon meticulously, noting collapse, fatigue, and occasional deaths, always with a calm, detached tone. As the weeks passed, exhaustion gradually took its toll. Some dancers disappeared from the streets, quietly resting or, in some cases, succumbing to the strain. Others continued, resilient or stubborn, moving in slow, rhythmic patterns that eventually became familiar to observers. The city adapted to the spectacle, adjusting market stalls, rerouting carts, and carefully observing the patterns of movement. Municipal records from the period reflect a quiet pragmatism. Rather than panic, the city sought to manage the unusual event with patience and order. Interestingly, some personal rituals emerged. One woman reportedly carried a small bell, chiming it in a deliberate pattern to mark her own pace. A man kept a saint's relic in his hand, believing it offered protection as his body moved involuntarily. These tiny flourishes reveal the human desire to impose structure and meaning even in the midst of uncontrollable circumstances. Such details, preserved in the chronicler's monotone, are quietly fascinating, a reminder that even in the most inexplicable events, people seek agency. By the end of the month, the plague gradually subsided. Streets cleared, markets resumed their usual rhythm, musicians packed up their instruments, dancers returned home, some recovering quickly, others slowly. The city, though temporarily transformed, settled back into its ordinary life. And yet the memory lingered. Chroniclers continued to write about the events for decades, preserving the gentle absurdity, the slow tragedy, and the hypnotic rhythm of hundreds of feet moving in unison. So tonight, as you imagine Strasbourg's streets once more, picture the faces in the crowd, the elderly man with his cane, the young woman dancing in quiet joy, the children weaving carefully, the musicians playing with cautious energy. The city moves around them, patient, watchful, bureaucratic, and quietly fascinated. History, in this instance, is not about battles or treaties, but about ordinary humans in extraordinary, inexplicable circumstances, humans surrendering for a time to rhythm, community, and the gentle compulsion of dance. We are going to talk about Napoleon Bonaparte and the curious case of the rabbit ambush. Now I know what you're thinking. Napoleon, the great conqueror, the master strategist, the the man who redrew maps and terrified Europe, ambushed by rabbits. But let's not rush. Let's float gently into the world of early 19th century France, where political tension, ambition, and just a touch of absurdity mingled in a rather peculiar way. It was the year 1807, a year that by the standards of European history might seem fairly ordinary. Napoleon was, of course, at the height of his power. He had already crowned himself emperor, reshaped continental Europe with campaigns that people would talk about for centuries, and was busily engaged in what could loosely be called strategic empire building. And like any ruler with a taste for triumph, he liked to celebrate victories, but not in a quiet, reflective, maybe even meditative way. No, Napoleon preferred grand displays, parades, and hunts. The hunt in question was arranged to commemorate a recent military success. Napoleon, his officers, and a small entourage of guests had decided that, after months of serious campaigning, it was time to relax, to indulge in one of the more traditional pastimes of the elite, hunting rabbits. Now, I should mention, these weren't your average neighborhood rabbits. These were domestic rabbits. Presumably, they were kept by the organizers specifically for such events. And like any good domestic animals, they had been raised in pens, accustomed to being fed, but unfortunately not accustomed to facing a man with a hunting rifle, or, as it would turn out, facing an emperor. So imagine a late spring morning. The air is cool, the sun is soft, and somewhere in the French countryside, Napoleon Bonaparte is preparing to lead a group of uniformed men into the fields. The rabbits are brought out, they are released, and the hunt begins. Now, the way these hunts normally worked, at least in theory, was fairly straightforward. The animals would scatter, the hunters would chase, and the whole thing would provide a modest amount of exercise, some fresh air, and a quiet display of skill. In practice, of course, things are rarely so tidy. And in this particular hunt, the first hint of chaos was almost immediately apparent. The rabbits, instead of scattering nervously in all directions, did something rather unexpected. They ran straight towards Napoleon and his hunting party. Why, you might ask? Well, it seems that these rabbits, being domesticated, had a certain sense of familiarity. They associated humans with food, so instead of fleeing from the hunters, they approached them eagerly. Imagine, if you will, a wave of fluffy, twitching, oddly determined creatures heading directly at some of the most disciplined soldiers in Europe. Accounts suggest that Napoleon himself tried to maintain composure. He may have raised his rifle, aimed carefully, and attempted to restore order. But here's the thing about rabbits. They are small, fast, and surprisingly persistent when motivated by the prospect of a snack. They darted left, right, and sometimes directly under the horses. And unlike human opponents, they did not negotiate, they did not retreat, and they certainly did not respect military hierarchy. Napoleon's aides, naturally, were horrified. Some sources describe officers leaping onto horses to try and direct the animals. Others reportedly waved sticks and shouted in vain. And the rabbits, quite boldly, kept coming. The hunt devolved into what could best be described as an accidental siege, with the rabbits taking the offensive. For a man used to commanding armies, this must have been a peculiar sensation, a complete loss of control, not to mention dignity. Now, why did this matter at all? Why, in a history lecture or YouTube video meant to soothe and gently lull, should we focus on such a strange event? Well, because it is a perfect example of a few things. First, it demonstrates that even the greatest historical figures were subject to the whims of fate, and in this case, the whims of domesticated lagomorphs. Second, it provides insight into the culture of the Napoleonic elite. Hunts like this were not merely leisure activities, they were displays of wealth, power, and control over nature. And the fact that this particular hunt went sideways suggests perhaps that nature and rabbits have a sense of humor. As the story unfolds, it seems that Napoleon's part attempted various strategies to regain control. Some accounts claim that the hunters fired shots into the air, perhaps hoping to scare the animals. Others reportedly tried forming lines to channel the rabbits into less chaotic paths. But the rabbits, being rabbits, ignored all attempts at negotiation. They simply kept coming, persistent as the tide. Now, one might imagine Napoleon's reaction. He was, after all, a man of immense self confidence and formidable ego, but reports suggest a mixture of bemusement and mild frustration. Perhaps he admired the rabbit's courage, or perhaps he was just trying not to look ridiculous in front of his officers. Either way, the scene is almost cinematic in its absurdity. Napoleon, one of history's great strategists, facing a relentless wave of small, furry adversaries. And there is a small, almost poetic irony here. Napoleon had spent years conquering nations, reorganizing armies, and imposing discipline on millions of people. Yet in the quiet French countryside, he was outwitted by creatures that could barely be considered sentient in any meaningful sense. It's a gentle reminder that history is full of moments where control is, quite literally, an illusion. Eventually, the chaos subsided. The rabbits, perhaps satisfied or simply distracted, dispersed. Napoleon's pride, presumably, required a discreet brushing off of dirt and feathers. And the event, though largely forgotten in broader historical accounts, lives on as a curious anecdote. The time a great emperor was ambushed by rabbits. It is worth noting, in passing, that this story is often used to illustrate broader points about Napoleonic power and image. Napoleon was obsessed with appearances. He wanted to be seen as omnipotent, infallible, and commanding. And yet, here was a scenario that defied all expectation, a scenario that could not be controlled, planned for, or even predicted. The rabbit ambush, in its absurdity, humanizes him. It reminds us that even the most imposing figures have moments of vulnerability, and sometimes those moments involve animals that are considerably smaller than themselves. As we drift along this narrative, let's consider the larger social and cultural context. Hunts like this were emblematic of elite leisure. They served multiple purposes: social bonding, demonstration of skill, and reinforcement of hierarchical structures. And yet, they were always tinged with the potential for mishap. Because, despite human intentions, the natural world has a way of asserting itself in ways both subtle and dramatic. In this case, dramatic meant rabbits running amok. So, what happened next in Napoleon's life? Well, the ambush did not derail his campaigns, nor did it tarnish his reputation in any meaningful sense. But it did leave a story, whispered among aides and later recounted in memoirs, of a moment when an emperor was humbled by something remarkably ordinary. And in this gentle irony, there is a kind of historical comfort. Because no matter how grand, how accomplished, or how terrifying a figure may be, there are always moments of absurdity, of gentle chaos, waiting just around the corner. And so, we leave Napoleon in the fields, perhaps brushing imaginary dust off his uniform, perhaps reflecting quietly on the peculiarities of life, and certainly reconsidering the simple wisdom that rabbits, though small, can be surprisingly ambitious. Let's float over now to the broader implications of this little episode, because the rabbit ambush is not merely a funny anecdote. It's a window into human nature, societal expectations, and the capriciousness of history itself. The event, though fleeting, tells us something essential, that even meticulously planned exercises of control are subject to the whims of chance, nature, and small, determined animals. And in that slow, almost meditative realization, there is a certain peace. History, after all, is not only about wars, treaties, and dynasties. It is about moments like this, a reminder that human beings, regardless of power or prestige, live alongside a world that refuses to be entirely ordered. And sometimes that world is just a little bit furry, a little bit twitchy, and a little bit relentless. So as you settle into your chair, perhaps with a blanket draped across your legs, let this story drift over you. Imagine the soft thump of paws, the rustle of grass, the mild exasperation of an emperor. Let your mind wander through the fields of France, past the soldiers and the rifles, past the pomp and circumstance, and into the quiet absurdity of history's small rebellions. Because in these gentle stories, in these slow, sleepy narratives, we find the heartbeat of the past, not in the triumphs, but in the tiny twitching details that remind us that life, in all its forms, has a way of surprising us. And with that, we will pause here for now, letting the image of Napoleon and his determined rabbits settle into your mind. We will continue next, exploring the peculiarities of elite hunts, the eccentricities of Napoleonic leisure, and other gentle oddities that history has left for us to discover. Let us continue with Napoleon Bonaparte, not the battlefield conqueror, not the master strategist, but the man behind the image, the emperor in his quieter, oddly absurd moments. After our discussion of the curious rabbit ambush, one might imagine that Napoleon's life was exclusively military triumphs and political machinations. And while there was certainly a great deal of that, there was also, quite predictably, a life punctuated by leisure, indulgence, and habits that, when examined closely, reveal a surprisingly human and occasionally peculiar side of history's famed emperor. Napoleon was, by many accounts, a man of strict routines. He arose early, often before dawn, and maintained a schedule that could have been written on a meticulous calendar down to the minute. Yet alongside this disciplined regimen, there existed a penchant for grand displays and ostentatious amusements. And so we find him, in those calmer moments away from the battlefield, participating in activities that ranged from the practical to the bizarre. The hunting expeditions, of course, were part of this. They were social events, status symbols, and as we have seen, occasionally absurd spectacles. Consider for a moment the broader context of hunting in Napoleonic France. To the modern eye, hunting might seem like a simple pastime, chasing animals across fields, perhaps with a rifle or a bow, perhaps enjoying the fresh air and the scenery. But for Napoleon and his contemporaries, it was about much more. It was about control. It was about asserting dominance over nature in the same way one might assert dominance over a conquered territory. It was, in essence, a rehearsal for empire building, only with more animals and slightly less bloodshed. And yet, there was an underlying tension in these hunts, because, as the rabbit ambush so clearly demonstrated, animals do not always adhere to human expectations. They have their own motivations, their own instincts, and their own surprising capacity for chaos. In some ways, the rabbits were a microcosm of the broader challenges Napoleon faced. He could plan meticulously, command armies, and dictate the movements of nations, but a wave of small, determined creatures could, in an instant, subvert his authority. It is both comforting and slightly amusing to remember this as we continue to explore the quieter, less serious aspects of his life. Napoleon's leisure time extended beyond hunting. He enjoyed walks, often taking long excursions with close advisors, discussing strategy, philosophy, or occasionally the trivialities of daily life. He had a taste for literature, though perhaps more for the tactical or historical texts than for poetry or fiction. And he had a curious relationship with food, which is both mundane and slightly revealing. Meals were often structured, deliberate, and served in abundance. Yet Napoleon was known to eat quickly, sometimes with little attention, perhaps reflecting a mind preoccupied with matters far larger than mere sustenance. It is in these small domestic details that the human side of Napoleon emerges. He was, after all, a man subject to the same routines, distractions, and minor irritations as anyone else. And while history often remembers him for his decisiveness and ruthlessness, these quieter moments remind us that even the most imposing figures have a mundane, sometimes oddly humorous side. Returning to the topic of hunting, one might note that Napoleon's excursions were not always limited to rabbits. Larger game, more dangerous and challenging, often provided a different kind of amusement and social signaling. Deer, boar, and wild fowl were common targets, and the hunts could last hours or even days. These events were highly choreographed, with assistants, beaters, and attendants working to ensure that the hunt proceeded according to plan. Yet, as the rabbit incident showed, even careful planning could be upended by nature's whims. One particularly interesting aspect of these hunts was the way they functioned as social instruments. Guests, officers, and allies were often invited to participate, not merely for sport, but to reinforce social hierarchies and alliances. Participation in a hunt could be a subtle indicator of favor or status within Napoleon's inner circle. It was, in a sense, a ritualized performance, demonstrating skill, obedience, and the ability to navigate both social and natural landscapes. And of course, it also provided ample opportunity for minor embarrassment, confusion, and gentle chaos. In examining Napoleon's personality through these leisurely pursuits, one also observes a man of contradictions. He could be meticulous, yet impulsive, commanding yet occasionally flustered, strategic yet surprised by the simplest forces of nature. The rabbit ambush encapsulates this duality perfectly. A meticulous planner, humbled by a small animal, a conqueror bested by creatures he likely underestimated. It is, in its own gentle way, a story of humility, absurdity, and the unexpected lessons history provides. But the rabbit ambush was not the only moment of eccentricity. Napoleon's interactions with his family and court also reveal a complex personality, often oscillating between warmth, suspicion, and mild exasperation. He had a deep affection for his siblings, particularly his sisters, though this affection was often tempered by strategic considerations. Marriages, alliances, and positions were often arranged not merely for personal preference, but for the consolidation of power and influence. And yet, within these structured, politically motivated arrangements, one finds moments of genuine care, concern, and occasional absurdity. Take, for example, his relationship with Josephine, his first wife. Their marriage, while romantic in some respects, was also characterized by practical concerns, strategic miscalculations, and a degree of personal drama that seems almost mundane when compared to the grand narratives of war and an empire. Napoleon's letters to Josephine reveal a man both tender and obsessive, concerned with her well being, yet simultaneously preoccupied with matters of state. It is within these letters, between lines of political maneuvering, that one senses the quieter rhythms of a historical life, small anxieties, personal quirks, and the ongoing struggle to balance public ambition with private emotion. Similarly, Napoleon's attention to detail extended into his domestic arrangements. He was known to oversee the management of his households meticulously, reviewing staff, schedules, and expenditures with a level of interest that might seem unusual for an emperor engaged in continental conquest. And while these details might appear minor, they provide insight into the broader character of a man who sought to control as much of his environment as possible, yet remained subject to the whims of animals, advisors, and unpredictable human behavior. In these quieter narratives, we also encounter the peculiarities of Napoleonic etiquette. Formal dinners, ceremonial receptions, and daily routines were imbued with ritual and expectation. Yet, even within these controlled settings, there was room for minor absurdities, such as the misbehavior of servants, the eccentricities of guests, or the occasional awkward moment that would ripple through the carefully orchestrated proceedings. One can imagine Napoleon, seated at a long table, attempting to maintain decorum while small mishaps, perhaps a spilled drink or a misplaced fork, reminded him that even order has its limits. As we continue to drift through this history, it becomes apparent that Napoleon's life, like the lives of many historical figures, is a blend of grandeur, discipline, and gentle absurdity. The rabbit ambush serves as a lens through which we can examine the tension between human intention and the unpredictable world. It reminds us that no amount of planning, authority, or strategy can fully account for the small, persistent forces that exist around us. And in this realization, there is a slow, comforting rhythm, a gentle reminder of the humbling, sometimes humorous nature of existence. And so, we pause here, letting the story of Napoleon's leisure, eccentricities, and the infamous rabbit ambush settle. Imagine the soft rustle of grass, the faint sound of hooves, the quiet murmur of attendants, and the subtle exasperation of an emperor gently reminded of life's unpredictability. Let these images float through your mind as we prepare to explore further peculiarities of Napoleonic life, his minor obsessions, daily routines, and the small human moments that history often overlooks. Let us linger a bit longer in the peculiar world of Napoleon Bonaparte, not as the great conqueror etched in textbooks, but as a man subject to whims, mishaps, and the occasional mildly embarrassing encounter with nature. After our exploration of the rabbit ambush and Napoleon's leisure pursuits, it is worth reflecting on what these moments reveal about him. there is, if you look closely, a pattern of contradictions and quiet absurdity. Here was a man capable of commanding millions, orchestrating battles with precision, and dictating the fate of nations, yet he could be flustered by small animals, inconvenienced by a spilled drink, or mildly irritated by an inattentive servant. It is this human side, subtle, slightly ridiculous, and endlessly relatable, that we linger on tonight. Napoleon's domestic routines were, in a word, meticulous. He maintained a strict schedule, rising early, often before dawn, attending to correspondence, reviewing reports, and meticulously planning his day. And yet, within this precision, there existed quirks that were distinctly personal. He had favorite pens, preferred certain arrangements of furniture, and maintained peculiar habits regarding meals. He was known to eat quickly, sometimes alone, and sometimes with a level of focus that suggests his mind was always elsewhere, on campaigns, strategies, or perhaps the next minor detail to control. One might find this mundane, but in a slow, sleepy recounting, it is oddly comforting. The great emperor, surrounded by grandeur and power, was also a man of minor routines, predictable irritations, and small pleasures. It reminds us that history is rarely composed solely of sweeping victories or catastrophic defeats. It is also made up of these quiet, ordinary, and occasionally absurd moments. Returning briefly to the rabbit ambush, one can see how it reflects a deeper truth about Napoleon's life. Control, even for the most disciplined, is always provisional. The rabbits, determined, unyielding, and mildly chaotic, remind us that no plan is ever perfect, no strategy entirely foolproof. And in this small, gentle humiliation, there is a quiet, almost meditative lesson. Life, like history, is full of interruptions, minor failures, and unexpected surprises. Napoleon's interactions with his family also provide glimpses of gentle absurdity. He cared deeply for his siblings, particularly his sisters, arranging marriages, positions, and even minor comforts with attention that could seem obsessive. Yet within these practical considerations, one finds glimpses of humor and eccentricity. Family letters often reveal minor complaints, odd requests, or amusing anecdotes that illustrate the small human side of even the most powerful figures. His marriage to Josephine, in particular, reflects a blend of romance, obsession, and practicality. Letters between them reveal a man deeply invested in appearances and emotional connection, yet constantly distracted by affairs of state. There is a certain charm in imagining Napoleon, the emperor, pacing quietly in a study, composing letters filled with tenderness, strategy, and occasional exasperation, all in the same breath. Beyond family and leisure, Napoleon had minor obsessions that might seem odd to modern eyes. He was attentive to his personal appearance, often scrutinizing uniforms, ensuring proper fit, and maintaining a level of presentation that reinforced both authority and personal comfort. He also had a taste for small indulgences, books, maps, and minor curiosities that reveal a man attuned to detail, endlessly curious, and occasionally distracted by minutiae. These small eccentricities extend to court life as well. Formal dinners, ceremonial events, and social obligations were meticulously arranged, yet always carried the potential for minor mishaps. A misbehaving servant, an inattentive guest, or a minor spill could ripple through the carefully choreographed setting, eliciting mild irritation or quiet amusement. And through it all, Napoleon maintained a presence of authority, gently navigating these minor disruptions with a mixture of patience, calculation, and occasional exasperation. So, as we draw this gentle exploration to a close, let us return one final time to the rabbits. The image of Napoleon, standing amidst a small army of officers, confronted by determined hopping creatures, is more than a humorous anecdote. It is a symbol of the limits of human control, the inevitability of small interruptions, and the quiet absurdity that accompanies even the greatest of lives. History, in this light, is not just about wars, treaties, or empires. It is also about these gentle, sometimes ridiculous moments that reveal the human side of power. It is about the way an emperor might pause, slightly flustered, amidst minor chaos and continue on. It is about the balance between ambition and humility, between careful planning and the unexpected forces of the world. Napoleon Bonaparte, in his quiet oddities, reminds us of the same truths, that even the most imposing, disciplined, and celebrated figures are subject to minor frustrations, that animals, servants, or even everyday life have the capacity to humble, amuse, and gently redirect the course of events. And that history, at its most human, is filled with these moments, moments that are quietly significant, softly absurd, and infinitely relatable. So as you sit back, perhaps with a blanket tucked around your shoulders, let these stories settle. Picture the gentle rustle of grass in the French countryside, the soft movement of rabbits, the quiet murmur of attendants, and Napoleon himself, thoughtful, slightly exasperated, yet endlessly human. Let this image drift through your mind, carrying with it the calm, unhurried rhythm of history's quieter stories. And with that, we conclude our exploration tonight. Napoleon, the rabbit ambush, his eccentricities, and the small human details of his life all gently remind us that history is as much about subtle absurdities as it is about grand triumphs. It is these details that linger softly in the mind and that, in the quiet of the evening, can soothe, entertain, and perhaps even lull one into a gentle reflection on the human experience across time. Thank you for joining this slow, meandering journey through history tonight. May your thoughts drift gently over fields, rabbits, and the quiet oddities of an emperor long past, and may the soft rhythm of these stories carry you into calm contemplation. And let's float over to Western Australia in the year 1932, when men in uniforms faced an enemy that no one expected. And, spoiler alert, the enemy was birds, large, surprisingly fast, and apparently strategically clever birds. Now, the official name for this bizarre conflict is the Great Emu War. Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. It involved emus. The large, flightless birds you might have seen running awkwardly across fields in documentaries, or maybe in a YouTube compilation of animals doing nothing particularly threatening. In 1932, these emus were considered a significant threat to farmers in Western Australia. The Great Depression was ongoing, wheat crops were failing, and as is often the case when humans are stressed, someone decided to go to war with birds. The story begins after World War I, which had left Australia with plenty of returning soldiers and not enough land for all of them. The government, being well-meaning but occasionally misguided, decided to grant veterans plots of farmland in Western Australia. These soldiers, turned farmers, were expecting to cultivate wheat, live peacefully, and contribute to the economy. Instead, they were confronted by thousands of emus migrating inland after breeding season. The birds, tall and armored with feathers, moved in formations that seemed almost military, and in a cruel twist of fate, wheat crops became their buffet. The farmers complained, naturally, and here's where the story slowly turned surreal. The government, ever practical and occasionally comically literal, decided the solution was military intervention. Not with scarecrows, not with fencing, no. They sent soldiers armed with machine guns to cull the emus. It was, in essence, Australia's first, and probably last, armed conflict against birds. The main protagonist on the human side was Major G.P.W. Meredith, a soldier who had served in World War I. Meredith was described as capable, competent, and reasonably optimistic about humans' ability to deal with wildlife. He arrived in Western Australia with a small team and 2 Lewis guns, along with 10,000 rounds of ammunition. One imagines that he probably expected a quiet, slightly tedious engagement, perhaps like a dull military exercise. Instead, he encountered something entirely unexpected: emus. The first encounter with the birds revealed a number of challenges that no military manual had prepared anyone for. Emus, it turns out, are extremely fast. They can sprint at roughly 30 miles per hour, zigzag, and scatter with remarkable coordination. They are also taller than many humans might assume, some reaching up to 6 feet in height, and they appear, at first glance, entirely harmless, like upright chickens with a sense of entitlement. But when confronted with gunfire, they displayed resilience and collective chaos that confounded the soldiers. In the initial battle, the soldiers attempted to line up the emus and fire in volleys, imagining that their firepower would quickly decimate the flock. What happened instead was a series of slow, frustrating failures. Emus would run away from bullets in seemingly random directions, regroup, and reapproach the fields from a different angle. At one point, Meredith reportedly fired 2,500 rounds and only managed to kill about a dozen birds. The emus, largely unbothered, continued their rampage, leaving wheat fields flattened in their wake. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the irony. Humans, after years of developing firearms, tactics, and artillery, were outsmarted, or at least outmaneuvered, by birds. The emus were not strategizing in a conscious sense, of course. They were just being emus. But in the context of military logic, this is extraordinary. The soldiers' manuals had failed them. History, as it turns out, had prepared humans to fight humans very well, but not fast, large, and slightly aggressive birds. The campaign continued for several weeks, with increasing levels of frustration on the human side. Meredith and his men tried different strategies: ambushes, coordinated attacks, and even mounting a gun on a truck. The last approach seemed promising at first. The mobility of the truck, combined with the firepower, could have given humans the upper hand. Unfortunately, the rough terrain, combined with the emu's unpredictable behavior, turned the truck into a cumbersome, slow-moving target. Emus ran alongside the vehicle, sometimes outpacing it, leaving soldiers to wave guns in the air, shooting at birds that, frankly, seemed amused by the proceedings. By the end of the war, which had lasted a few weeks, the results were, let's say, underwhelming. The emus had largely won. Several hundred birds were killed, which sounds impressive until you consider that tens of thousands of emus continued to roam the region. The farmers were still facing crop destruction, and Major Meredith returned to Perth, perhaps a little humbler, possibly questioning the wisdom of humans in general. Newspapers at the time reported the event with a mixture of bemusement and mild scandal. Army defeated by birds was a headline that made people chuckle quietly, maybe while sipping tea, perhaps imagining the birds holding a council meeting to plan the next attack. The Great MU War, while utterly absurd, had broader implications. The Australian government realized that conventional military methods were ineffective for wildlife management. In the following years, fences, bounty systems, and other agricultural strategies replaced soldiers with machine guns. The emus, meanwhile, continued to thrive, becoming almost legendary in local folklore, and in the slow, sleepy cadence of history, humans quietly admitted defeat. Not in a formal treaty sense, of course. No scrolls were signed, no diplomats shook hands, but in reality, the birds had prevailed. Let's float over to some of the smaller, but oddly fascinating details. Soldiers noted that emus seemed to act in a collective, almost organized manner. When fired upon, they would split into smaller groups, regroup, and approach from new directions. Witnesses reported that the birds displayed a curious combination of stubbornness and casual indifference. Unlike humans, who might panic or retreat after a few shots, the emus appeared entirely unconcerned by danger, as if confident in the eventual chaos of human planning. Interestingly, this campaign also had a bureaucratic element. The government had allocated resources, organized reports, and had officials monitoring the situation. When results came back showing that 2,500 rounds had killed 12 birds, or something similarly embarrassing, there was some internal confusion. Was this a failure of planning, weaponry, or strategy? The answer, likely, was all of the above, but it was handled in the quiet, official manner governments often prefer, by quietly moving on and hoping the birds would forget the incident. It's worth noting the human psychology at play. Farmers were genuinely distressed, crops were being destroyed, livelihoods were threatened, and the government's solution, machine guns, seemed practical at first glance. Soldiers, trained in human combat, faced a challenge that no drill or textbook could prepare them for. And emus, oblivious to human intentions, simply did what emus do: eat, run, and breed. There's a subtle lesson here in the unpredictability of nature and the occasional futility of human intervention. Now, as we drift slowly through this story, imagine the absurdity of the scene. Soldiers on rough terrain, dusty fields stretching for miles, guns clattering, bullets whizzing, and emus darting like feathered shadows. The wind blows lightly across the wheat, the sun hangs low in the sky, and somehow, in this quiet chaos, humans look slightly ridiculous, and the birds, entirely unconcerned, simply go about their business, winning a conflict they never intended to wage. Eventually, the government admitted defeat, not with fanfare, but with quiet resignation. Subsidies and bounty systems were introduced. Farmers could now pay a nominal fee to have emus removed from their fields. This solution, while less dramatic than military intervention, proved far more effective. And so, the emus, mostly unscathed, continued to roam, live and, in the annals of history, quietly humiliate humans. In retrospect, the Great MU War holds a special place in history. It's not just a funny anecdote, it's a subtle commentary on human arrogance, the unpredictability of nature, and the way ordinary events, like birds eating wheat, can be transformed into historical spectacles. It's also a reminder that sometimes the quietest, most persistent forces win, not with noise or fury, but simply by being themselves. And so, as you drift through this story, consider the soldiers, their futile efforts, and the calm, unstoppable emus. The war ended without formal resolution, treaties, or headlines in major European papers. It was, in every sense, a quiet, sleepy disaster. And yet, like all history, it endures. Perhaps not because of strategy or heroism, but because of absurdity, persistence, and the unshakable confidence of birds. We'll pause here for a gentle reflection. Imagine the wheat fields stretching endlessly, the emus scattered across the horizon, and the soldiers packing up guns, quietly acknowledging defeat. There's no battle song, no heroics, only the soft, persistent rhythm of feathers and wind. And as you breathe slowly, imagine the emus walking away, victorious, indifferent, entirely emu. If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're not, that's even better. When we last drifted off together, the Australian military had just finished doing something it would prefer not to remember. The emus were still alive, the wheat was still damaged, and the soldiers were quietly packing up their machine guns, like guests who realized they were very much not welcome at the party. Now, what happens after a failed war against birds is not something most history books prepare you for. There are no victory parades, no medals, no statues of heroic generals staring into the middle distance. There is only paperwork, endless soul draining paperwork. And Australia, being a modern nation with a respectable bureaucracy, leaned fully into that part. Reports were written, letters were sent, explanations were drafted very carefully, using words like limited success and challenging terrain. Nobody used the phrase the birds absolutely embarrassed us, even though everyone was thinking it. Major G.P.W. Meredith returned to Perth and submitted his official assessment. To his credit, Meredith did not lie. He didn't exaggerate success or pretend things went better than they did. He calmly explained that emus were fast, scattered easily, absorbed bullets better than expected, and behaved in ways that made traditional military engagement impractical. That's a very polite way of saying, sir, the emus simply refused to cooperate. Meredith even added a strangely poetic observation. He noted that emus seemed to have a sort of informal leadership structure. When one bird was shot, the others did not panic. They just kept moving, almost as if nothing had happened, almost as if the entire operation was beneath their notice. This detail did not help the Army's case. Back in Parliament, the reaction was mixed. Some officials laughed quietly, others were annoyed. A few were deeply uncomfortable with the idea that government money had been spent on ammunition that mostly ended up embedded in dirt, trees, and the distant memories of fleeing birds. Newspapers, of course, had a wonderful time. Cartoons appeared, editorials were written. The phrase "Emu War" began circulating, which was not an official term and was absolutely not appreciated by the Department of Defense. But once a name sticks, it sticks forever, especially if it's funny. And this is where the story slows down even more, because after the guns stopped firing, nothing dramatic happened. There was no second wave of soldiers, no renewed offensive, just silence and emus, lots of emus. Farmers were still angry, understandably so. Their crops were still being eaten. The Great Depression was still happening. Money was still tight. And the emus, blissfully unaware of global economic suffering, continued to migrate exactly as they always had. So farmers did what humans have always done when authority fails them. They complained louder. Letters poured in. Requests for renewed military action were submitted. Some farmers even asked for heavier weapons. This suggestion was politely ignored, possibly because someone finally realized that escalating a war against wildlife rarely ends well. Instead, the government pivoted, slowly, reluctantly, with the enthusiasm of someone admitting they were wrong, but refusing to say it out loud. They introduced a bounty system. Now, bounties are interesting. They're what governments use when they want results without being directly responsible for how those results happen. Farmers were paid for each emu killed. No soldiers, no uniforms, no headlines, just quiet transactions involving feathers and receipts. This worked, not spectacularly, but adequately. Over time, emu numbers near farmland decreased, crops stabilized, and the whole situation began to fade into the background of national memory. But here's the thing: the emus never stopped existing. They adapted, they always do. They shifted routes, they avoided fenced areas, they learned in their own emu way where humans were most annoying and where they were easiest to ignore. And so, without realizing it, Australia entered into an unspoken agreement with its most awkward adversary. You stay over there, we stay over here. Let's not do the gun thing again. What makes the Great Emu War so strangely comforting as a bedtime story is that nothing truly terrible happens. No cities burn, no empires collapse, no dramatic final stand, just mild incompetence, environmental misunderstanding, and birds being birds. And yet, it reveals so much about how humans think. There's an assumption, deeply baked into modern thinking, that technology always wins. That if you bring enough machinery, enough firepower, enough planning, you can impose order on chaos. The emus politely disagreed. They didn't fight back. They didn't attack soldiers. They didn't even acknowledge the war. They simply continued existing at a pace that human systems could not keep up with, which is honestly one of the most quietly humiliating outcomes possible. Years later, historians would revisit the event, usually with a smile. It became a favorite anecdote in lectures, a reminder that not all problems are solved by force, and that sometimes nature responds to human aggression with a mild inconvenience. Major Meredith himself faded from public attention. He didn't write a memoir titled How I Lost a War to Birds. He lived the rest of his life without much fanfare, and one imagines that whenever the topic came up at social gatherings, he changed the subject very smoothly. Because what do you say? Yes, I fought bravely. Against whom? Emus. And so, the Great Emu War slipped gently into history, not as a tragedy, not as a triumph, but as a story people tell when they want to feel slightly better about their own mistakes. Because no matter how badly your day went, at least you didn't deploy machine guns against birds and lose. As we drift toward the end of this part, picture Australia again. Wide skies, dry fields, emus moving in the distance, tall and indifferent. The land unchanged, the birds unchanged, humans slightly wiser, but not much. And that's usually how history goes, not with a bang, not with a scream, but with a quiet acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, we didn't think this through. Let's rest here for a moment. No lessons, no morals, just the soft knowledge that sometimes the universe humbles us using feathers. When you're ready, we'll continue, slowly, gently. So by the time we arrive at the quiet aftermath of the Great MU War, something very human begins to happen. The kind of thing that doesn't make headlines, but happens constantly in the background of history. People stop talking about it, not all at once, not dramatically, just less. Fewer letters, fewer complaints, fewer parliamentary questions that everyone pretends are very serious while secretly wishing they weren't involved. The emus are still there, of course. They've always been there. They're native to Australia, which means from the emus' perspective, this entire story is just a brief period where humans acted especially strange. A phase, like wearing uncomfortable shoes or inventing new taxes. From the human side, though, the story slowly gets filed away under regrettable experiments. The bounty system continues quietly. Farmers adapt. Some build better fences. Others change crops. A few just accept that living on the Australian continent means occasionally losing an argument with wildlife, and life goes on. What's interesting is how quickly the Great Emu War transforms from an embarrassment into a joke. Not immediately. At first, it's awkward. People avoid mentioning it. Officials refer to it in dry language. Pest control measures, agricultural support operations. Very serious words, carefully chosen to avoid saying the army failed to stop birds. But time has a way of softening things. A few years pass, then a few decades. Eventually, someone brings it up at a dinner party. Someone else laughs, and suddenly, it's safe. The war becomes a story rather than a memory. By the mid 20th century, it's firmly in anecdote territory, a strange footnote, something historians mention to keep students awake during lectures about agricultural policy. And yet, the reason it survives at all is because it taps into something deeply relatable. The idea that humans, with all their planning and confidence, can be completely undone by something simple, stubborn, and unimpressed. Emus don't symbolize rebellion, or intelligence, or strategy. They symbolize indifference, and indifference is incredibly hard to defeat. There was no final confrontation, no moment where the emus won, no declaration. They didn't need one. Victory arrived quietly, carried on long legs, disappearing into scrubland. And this is where the story becomes almost meditative, because if you strip away the uniforms, the guns, the reports, and the headlines, what you're left with is a familiar pattern. Humans encounter a problem. They assume control is possible. They escalate quickly. They fail. They adapt slowly. And eventually, they move on. The Great MU War didn't change Australian politics. It didn't reshape military doctrine. It didn't alter global history. What it did was leave behind a small, persistent reminder that not every problem responds to force, especially not problems with feathers. Modern Australians tend to embrace the story now. It fits neatly into national humor, self deprecating, slightly absurd, proudly strange. There are memes. Of course, there are memes. There are jokes about emus being undefeated, about declaring them the true rulers of Australia, about humans losing a war they technically started and then immediately regretted. And humor, in this case, acts like closure, because laughing at something is often easier than examining it too closely. But if you do slow down, and we have all the time in the world here, you can see how gently revealing the story really is. The soldiers weren't foolish. They were doing what they were trained to do. The farmers weren't cruel. They were protecting their livelihoods. The government wasn't malicious, just optimistic in the wrong direction, And the emus weren't villains, they were just emus. This is not a story about failure in the dramatic sense. It's a story about mismatch between tools and problems, between expectations and reality. Machine guns are very effective at certain things. Large, fast, widely dispersed birds are not one of them. By the late 1930s, the Great Emu War had quietly settled into its final form, a historical curiosity, a bedtime story almost, something strange enough to be memorable, but gentle enough not to disturb sleep. And perhaps that's why it endures, because it doesn't demand attention. It doesn't insist on meaning. It just sits there, calmly reminding us that sometimes the universe responds to human ambition with a shrug. As we drift toward the end of this part, imagine the Australian landscape once more, wide, open, mostly unconcerned with human narratives. Emus walking steadily across it, the same way they did before 1932, and the same way they do now. No medals, no monuments, just birds continuing to exist, and humans quietly agreeing to let them. Rest here for a moment. Nothing else needs to happen. By the time the Great Emu War finally settles into its permanent place in history, it has stopped being an event altogether. It becomes something softer, a story people tell without tension, a sentence that starts with, "Did you know?" A reminder that not all conflicts are loud and not all endings are clear. There are no official documents declaring the war over, no formal announcement, no acknowledgement of defeat. The guns simply stop, the EMUs continue walking, and the government quietly decides to never try that again, which honestly is one of the more mature endings history has to offer. Over the years, the landscape changes, fences get better, farming techniques improve, wildlife management becomes its own field of study, handled by people who do not bring machine guns to bird problems. The emus adapt right along with everything else, because that's what animals do. They adapt, slowly, consistently, without needing meetings. And the Great Emu War drifts further away. It's not taught as a warning. It's not studied as a strategy. It's remembered because it's human, because it shows a moment where confidence ran ahead of understanding, where force was chosen over patience, where a problem that required quiet solutions was met with loud ones instead, and the world so very gently declined to cooperate. Historians sometimes debate whether it should even be called a war. That word feels too dramatic, too serious, too heavy for something that ended in paperwork and mild embarrassment. But the name sticks because humans like to exaggerate their own importance, even when they lose, especially when they lose. The emus, of course, never participate in this discussion. They don't care what we call it. They don't care that people still talk about them. They don't care that they're technically undefeated. They walk, they eat, they exist. And that, in the end, is the quiet victory. There's something oddly comforting about that. The idea that the world doesn't always respond to our plans. That sometimes nature simply continues while we argue about what went wrong. No villains, no heroes, just momentum. The Great Emu War doesn't end with a lesson carved in stone. It ends the way many things do in real life, with people slowly agreeing to stop bringing it up. And maybe that's enough. As we reach the end of this story, imagine the dust settling, the fields stretching out under a wide Australian sky, the last echoes of gunfire long gone, the emus already somewhere else, doing something completely unrelated to human history. There is no moral that demands attention, No takeaway that needs effort, just the soft understanding that even our strangest mistakes become calm stories over time. Stories that lose their sharp edges, stories that are safe to listen to while drifting off. And so, tonight we leave the emus where they've always been, walking quietly, unbothered, and unimpressed, and we leave the humans too, slightly wiser, slightly humbler, definitely more careful around birds. Thank you for staying with this slow, strange chapter of history. Let your thoughts fade, let the noise settle, sleep well, and good night.